I just Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Kiesler. I am one of the two co-chairs of the Climate Reality Project here in New York City. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our first in-person meeting since the pandemic. And we're here at the Society for Ethical Culture on the west side of the Central Park. And I would like everyone to bear with us because this is our first time that we've done a hybrid meeting. So I would love for everyone to keep your expectations as low as possible. And hopefully we can try to overcome those. And ongoing, we'll try to perfect, we'll try to improve, but we will never perfect. I can promise you that now. At our recent leadership team retreat, we decided to include in-person gatherings and field trips as a part of our ongoing chapter meetings so that we can deepen our social connections and share our advocacy work and have some fun. So this is, as a part of that, we're having this meeting today here at the Society, at the New York Society for Ethical Culture. And I would like to thank them because it's a New York institution that is a humanist community dedicated to ethical relationships, social justice, and democracy. And they've been around since 1876. And I encourage everyone to please visit their website at ethical.nyc to explore all that they have to offer. I'd also like to highlight that our next chapter meeting will be a field trip. It'll be on October 8th, and it's to the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. And we'll have, at the end of the meeting, I'll be asking Regina Valdez, our Director of Programming, to give everyone a little debrief on that, on what that'll look like. But we'll have buses going up there and so on. And then our November 23rd chapter meeting will be led by our food committee. And that will also be held here at the Society, and it'll be dedicated to urban agriculture. So with that, I'm going to move on to the topic of today's meeting, which is voting to accelerate climate solutions. And I'd like to start by providing an example or some examples of how we've been, even with the slimmest of majorities at the federal level, we've been able to fight the climate crisis like never before. And just since last November, the legislative branch have passed 4 landmark pieces of legislation. The first was a bipartisan infrastructure bill, which had large investments, over $50 billion for climate resilience and weatherization, $65 billion for clean energy and grid investments, and $7.5 billion for EV charging. Then the CHIPS Act recently could actually direct up to $67 billion towards the growth of zero carbon industries and climate relevant research, according to the RMI. And then obviously the big one was the Inflation Reduction Act, and that contained almost $370 billion in various climate and clean energy provisions. The largest investment in climate, in fighting the climate crisis ever. And then just last month, something that a lot of people haven't really heard about, but the Senate ratified the Kigali Amendment. And this amendment will phase out the use of HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which are thousands of times more potent than CO2 at heating up the earth. So the EPA projects that that amendment will avoid up to 0.5 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century. So just in the past year, our legislature and the president passed and signed 4 major pieces of legislation that will significantly impact or significantly forward our fight for against the climate crisis. And here at the local level, at the state level, we've passed the CLCPA a few years back, which is a groundbreaking piece of legislation. And here in the city, Local Law 97 and the All Electric Building Act are really leading the way across the country in terms of decarbonizing the housing sector, which is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So I mentioned all these things just to bring the point that our votes count. And because of, we were very active in getting, and not only our votes, but our advocacy and making sure that our legislatures prioritize this activity in fighting the climate crisis. That has effects. And so tonight we're about 6 weeks out from the election on November 8th. And we have the chance to further that success. And there are people I would like to actually introduce two of the speakers tonight who are going to help us understand how we can help in the fight against the climate crisis. And the first one is Nathaniel Stinnett. Nathaniel is the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, which is a non-partisan nonprofit that uses data, analytics, and behavioral science to mobilize environmentalists to vote. He has held a variety of senior leadership and campaign manager positions on US Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns, and he sits on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. He will explain how critical New York is in the 2022 elections.
Double tasking and gonna cook and watch this climate meeting.
Yeah, can you mute the?
Oh,
I think everyone was muted, but as they came in. But so he's going to explain to us how critical New York is in the 2022 elections, due to the recent court mandated redistricting, and how all of us can get involved in that. And actually, the California and New York actually have the most competitive U.S. House races of any state. So this is a really important discussion. And I'm going to introduce our second speaker, Jess Ottney, after Nathaniel's presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Nathaniel for his presentation.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm just so honored to be here. I'm really excited to be speaking alongside Jess Ottney, who is going to tell you all about the upcoming climate bond measure, which is really, really important. And I'm so excited that all of you have decided to spend some of your time this evening learning and talking and asking questions about the importance of voting as a climate activist. As Paul mentioned, we are 6 weeks, almost to the hour, from polls closing on the East Coast for the midterms. So this is just 42 days away. This is a very, very important high leverage moment in time for the climate community. So I am going to share my screen here. And as Paul mentioned, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. Then I'm going to drill down into some of the details about the opportunities that the climate movement has this election season in New York. And then we'll get on to all the important stuff that Jess has to say. So the Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on two things: finding environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote and then we turn them into better voters. What that also means is we don't do a lot of the stuff that your typical environmental organizations might do. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't endorse candidates. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment, as odd as that might seem. A good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. What we focus on is finding people who don't need their minds changed. We find people who care so deeply about climate or the environment that it's quite literally their #1 priority over all other issues, yet they're not voting. And what that allows us to do is make a purely behavioral intervention and not have to worry about education or convincing them to care about the climate crisis, and instead just worry about getting their rear ends out the door. And that's important for a few reasons, but the biggest of which is changing behavior is a little bit easier and a lot cheaper than changing minds. And so this is a really, really big opportunity. Now, part of the reason why we focus on this particular area is also because we've got a problem in the environmental movement. And even though, as Paul said, we are coming off a year of some extraordinary successes, not just at the federal level, but also at many state and local levels, I don't think we do ourselves any favors by pretending that we have more power in the environmental movement than we actually have. And just as an example, some recent battleground state polling that we did at the Environmental Voter Project. And you can see it right here. This is in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. So 4 really important battleground states. We asked likely midterm voters what their #1 issue priority was. and 4% listed climate or other environmental issues. Now, the good news is that's about twice as much as you would have seen in the 2018 midterms. But the bad news is the policy wins we in the environmental movement need to get in the coming years aren't going to get easier. They're going to get harder and harder than the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act or the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And if we want to win those battles, the simple truth is that we need more than 4% of people showing up who are casting their ballots to have climate be their #1 priority. This is not a big enough number to scare the bejesus out of politicians so they do what we need them to do. And so, although a lot of what I'm going to say is good news, I want to start with maybe a little bit of cold water and just say that we need to admit to ourselves that we need more political power. We need more political power than this. Now, the reason we at the Environmental Voter Project choose to try to address this problem through behavior change is because as we've dug into a lot of polling data and predictive modeling data, we've realized the reason so few voters care deeply about climate and the environment is actually not because too few Americans care deeply about climate and the environment. Let me say that again, because that distinction is important. Even though there are very few voters who list climate and other environmental issues as a top priority, that doesn't mean there are very few Americans who do. If you broaden your aperture and actually look at the entire population, or even just the population of registered voters, there are tens of millions of them who list climate as a top priority. So why do so few of them show up when you just look at likely midterm voters? Well, for one pretty simple reason, and that is that environmentalists are disproportionately poor voters. It turns out that the environmental movement doesn't have a persuasion problem as much as we have a turnout problem or a behavioral problem. It turns out that there are tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists out there who just don't show up and cast their ballots when there's an election. And to give you an example of this, just looking at some of the really big recent federal elections, in 2016, 10.1 million already registered voters, already registered, 10.1 million already registered voters who have a very high likelihood of listing climate or other environmental issues as their #1 priority, just stayed home and didn't cast a ballot in an election that was decided by 77,000 votes. You look at the 2018 midterm, our most recent midterm, 12.4 million already registered super environmentalists stayed home and didn't vote. And looking at public voting records, and if you don't understand this, I think it's important to drill down on it. Who you vote for is secret, but whether you vote or not is public record. And so looking at public voting records and combining them with our research on who the environmentalists are and who they aren't, we look ahead to this election that's going to take place in 6 weeks, and we see over 13 million registered voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet they've never voted in a midterm election before. Now I see some of you shaking your heads like in frustration, like, dear God, why aren't these environmentalists voting? And I get it. But what I'd also like to suggest to you is that this is a huge opportunity, because we live in a moment in time where it's becoming increasingly hard to change people's opinions about climate change. And what these large populations of voters represent are people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They just need to start voting. They need to start doing this very impactful action. And so this is why we at the Environmental Voter Project focus on this one intervention, finding these already persuaded dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists who don't vote, and then turning them into better voters. Very briefly, I'm going to describe how we do this and what some of our results are, and then I'm going to dive into the New York data. So we take a 3-step process. You only have about 15 to 20 minutes. And so I'm not going to dive into a lot of detail on these 3 steps, but the 3 steps are: first, identification. We build predictive models on voter files. These are the same tools that US Senate and gubernatorial and presidential campaigns use to individually target people based on an issue they prioritize. If you have in your mind still that political campaigns target demographic groups like soccer moms or NASCAR dads, forget about that. That's not how campaigns target people anymore. Instead, what they do is they poll tens of thousands of people and combine that polling data with lots of publicly available information. And they can assign a score to each individual voter in a voter file, telling you how likely they are to care deeply about particular issues. Is it a little creepy? Yes, it is. It's also enormously precise. And what this allows us to do is on an individual level say, oh, Mary Ann Smith at 123 Main Street has a 92% likelihood of listing climate as her top priority. And we know from public voter files that she never has voted in a midterm before. And that allows us to say, oh, she's a turnout target. She doesn't need her mind changed. She's already with us. We just need to get her out the door. We need to turn her into a better voter. And when we get to that point, when we identify this population of people who, like you, shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, they're just not voting, that allows us to move to the second step, mobilization. Because then we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. As long as we can figure out how to get these people to vote, that's all we need to do. So what we do at the Environmental Voter Project is we've got over 6,000 now volunteers around the country who canvass and call and mail, and we send digital ads to these non-voting environmentalists. We run hundreds of randomized control experiments each year, figuring out which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to do one thing, and that is turn them into better voters. And then the third step is habit reinforcement. You don't need to sort of live behavioral science like I do to guess that if you want to turn a non-voter into a voter, you can't just parachute in once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. Like, that's not how you change behavior. And so what we do is we truly work year-round in elections, big and small, local, state, federal, primary, general, special. Like, every single election is a precious behavioral intervention opportunity, allowing us to build good voting habits among these super environmentalists. And so just as an example, even last year, an odd year, we were active in 381 different elections. Not because each of them was important for environmental policymaking. In fact, truth be told, probably a majority of them weren't. But all of them were important if what you're trying to do is change behavior. Our approach is, how dare you skip an election if what you're trying to do is turn non-voters into voters. And what that's allowed us to do in randomized control trials is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for outside variables. I'm not going to dive into what randomized control trials are because I've only got like 8 more minutes. But essentially what this allows us to do is isolate how much are these interventions increasing turnout while controlling for all these campaigns spending lots of money. And as you can see, just last year, these types of interventions increased turnout as much as 4 percentage points in local elections, as much as 1.2 percentage points in statewide general elections. And those might not seem like big numbers, but ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.2% is in Pennsylvania. That's a big number in this business. And that 0.9% you see in Georgia, that was for those 2 US Senate runoffs that decided control of the United States Senate. Where $1 billion with a B, $1 billion were spent in Georgia for those 2 US Senate runoffs. We spent $550,000 and we were still able to isolate that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout almost 1 percentage point among the 300,000 people we were targeting. This is what the power of this approach can yield. And moreover, over the long term, we're active in 17 states now. The light green ones, including New York, we just expanded into last year. But you see in the darker green ones, the remaining 12, where we've been active for multiple years. We can now see on voter files that of the 8.7 million unique voters we've communicated with, all of whom by definition are awful voters or we wouldn't be talking to them, well, over 1,030,000 of them have now become such consistent voters that they voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. Now, to be clear, this is different from a randomized control trial. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1 million non-voters into super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other organization talking to these low propensity environmental voters, getting them to vote in little local elections. And that's why we're getting results like this, and election specific results like you saw in the last slide. So we're active in these 17 states. For the upcoming midterm elections, we are targeting 5.8 million super environmentalists who are already registered to vote in these 17 states, yet they have never voted in a midterm election before. So they're ripe for this nonpartisan, proven in randomized control trial turnout intervention. We just need more volunteers. We just need the people to make the phone calls or knock on the doors. And again, we'll give you the proven script. It's like a turnkey field operation. We just hand it over, we train you, and we say, go get them. Very quickly in New York, this is what we see. We've identified over 1.1 million already registered voters who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate or other environmental issues as their top priority, yet they have never voted in a midterm election before. All right, what does that number mean in the context of New York? Well, there are 13.4 million registered voters in the state, but it isn't like all of them show up for midterms. Only 6.1 million showed up last time New York State had a midterm. So this target population of low propensity environmental voters, people who are already with us, they just need to get pushed to the polls. That population is so big that it would equal 18.8% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm election. What does this population look like? Well, as you can see at the bottom, sure, it comes as no surprise to you, they are disproportionately young. So you'll see we've got 2 rows at the bottom. The very bottom row is the distribution, the demographic distribution that we see among all registered voters. The row above it is the distribution that we see among these also registered voters who care deeply about the environment and don't vote in midterms. So disproportionately young. They are also more likely to be women than men, but just a little bit. We actually see greater gender gaps. Actually, there's sex gaps in voter file. Voter files don't have gender information. They have sex information, but we see a broader sex gap in a lot of other states than in New York. They are disproportionately people of color, but that's largely driven by Hispanic and AAPI voters. Again, that is something that we also see in many other states. And then I just want to spend the last 2 or 3 minutes drilling down on these 9 congressional districts that, according to all prognosticators and also according to public polling, are pretty competitive. And you can see them listed there. But on the next slide, I'm going to give a little bit more information, because I know that Jess is going to go into a little bit of statewide stuff, and in particular, the importance of this crucial ballot measure that we have coming up statewide. But just to look at some of the US House districts, there are 9 competitive US House districts in New York. To give you some context, that's 3 times as many competitive US House districts as there are in Texas. That's a huge number. I think nationwide, maybe there are 75 or 80 competitive House districts. So this is a lot. Like most people around the country 6 weeks from today, when they're watching election returns roll in on CNN, they're going to be hearing people talk about Long Island and the Hudson Valley. So let's talk about some of these congressional districts. The 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, those are these districts right here on Long Island. 17th, 18th, 19th, 22nd, that's up here. Hudson Valley going out to Binghamton, up to Utica. And then the 11th, that's sort of down here, mostly Staten Island, but a little bit of the other boroughs, of another borough. These are the districts that could very well end up deciding national control of the US House. And as you'll see, the partisan lean, that means in which direction, Republican or Democrat, do these districts lean compared to the overall national average, is really pretty tight. It's really pretty tight. If you were to look at pretty much every other state, you'd see them much more dramatically gerrymandered than this. You'd see like R+40 or D+50 districts. These are really tight districts. And as you'll see over here, in some of them, these super environmentalists who have never voted in a midterm before, they're just enormous numbers of them. Enormous numbers of them. I mean, up and down the Hudson Valley here, 39,000 in the 17th, 33,000 in the 18th, 34 in the 19th. Get out on Long Island, some of these districts have as many as 47, 38,000. Low propensity environmental voters are going to make a big, big difference in these races, not to mention what Jess is about to talk to you about. And so I'll just close by saying, if you would like to get involved in knocking on doors, in making phone calls, boy, do we make it easy. I want to remind you, it's totally nonpartisan, but these are proven messages that we've seen in randomized control trials, increased turnout of these non-voting environmentalists. You can go to environmentalvoter.org, you can sign up to Canvas, and we'll train you online, get you the materials, get you the script. You can sign up for a phone bank. You don't need to have any prior experience. But even if you don't get involved with us, get involved with what Jess is about to talk to you about, and just be loud and proud about the fact that you, as someone who cares deeply about the climate crisis, are a voter. You are voting this year, because whether the environmental movement shows up in force in New York State this year is going to make a big, big, big difference. So please show up. And please make sure everybody else you know who cares about these issues knows that this is what they need to do. Real environmentalists vote, especially in 2022. Thank you, thank you, thank you so, so much.
Okay, thank you, Nathaniel. I really appreciate your that presentation, and it's very interesting, and it's very, I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay, great. Are you doing the pinning, Deepa? Okay, great. So as I promised, this the technological aspect of this meeting is horrific. And I hope it hasn't been too distracting to people. But I'd like to highlight there's actually a large contingent of climate reality leaders here in person, about 15 of us, and quite a few online as well. And it's really, everyone was really wrapped in attention, Nathaniel, with your presentation. It was really an amazing, to point out just how important New York is and how easy it is to get to help. So with that, I'm gonna just introduce our next speaker, who is Jess Ottney. And Jess is the Nature Conservancy's New York Policy and Strategy Director. She's leading the Nature Conservancy's New York policy team and overseeing conservation programs across the state. And since joining the Conservancy in 2007, Jessica and her team have successfully advocated for the enactment of dozens of laws and regulations, including the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which I referred to earlier, and helped secure billions in funding to protect and restore New York's natural resources and address global warming. Jess will explain the importance of New York's 4.2 billion Environmental Bond Act, which is on the ballot on November 8th. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Jess.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Jess. And before I do, just please put any questions in the chat because we'll be having a Q&A session immediately after Jess's presentation. Thank you,
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. And hello, everyone. I see some wonderful familiar faces, some members of our Bond Act Coalition, some people who have been wonderfully active in local work we've been doing in the Capital Region of New York. So it's so great to be with all of you. I want to thank you for your time and for inviting me to speak to your group, and really thank you also for the work that you've done as part of coalitions to pass things like the state's climate law. It's been incredible. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an opportunity that environmental voters have this fall to help advance clean water, climate action, conservation. And I was loving that last presentation because a lot of the tools that were mentioned on, public opinion research and voter modeling were used to construct this campaign as well. So it was nerdy and validating. So thank you for that, Nathaniel. So this fall is pretty exciting. That for the first time in a generation since 1996, we have an environmental bond measure on the New York State ballot. And it couldn't be timed better, because with so much action on funding at the federal level with the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the most recently passed measure, the Inflation Reduction Act, New York could be setting aside money that will really position us well to leverage those federal funds and pull down as much as possible for programs that protect our clean water, reduce the pollution that causes climate change and harms people's health, and conserves the natural resources we depend on. So this is a really exciting moment for New York. The Clean Water, Clean Air, Green Jobs Bond Act will provide $4.2 billion for projects in communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about what types of projects. So there's kind of four big categories in the Bond Act. And the first one is clean drinking water. And this is something that we know all voters support, regardless of who they are, really. These issues are very popular because obviously water is life. We all need clean water to drink, to keep ourselves clean, to live our daily lives. And we're so dependent on the infrastructure that brings our water to our home and also removes sewage from our homes. And we've seen this infrastructure failing across the state over and over again. So this bond measure will invest in clean drinking water infrastructure. It will also help us remove lead pipes. A lot of New Yorkers, especially New Yorkers who live in disadvantaged communities, are still consuming water from lead pipes. And finally, it will help with our stormwater infrastructure as we see the impacts of climate change already happening across New York State. We know that we need to increase the capacity of our stormwater systems, as well as conserve natural resources that can help buffer us during extreme weather. A lot of this Bond Act is focused on that because we cannot continue to see deaths like we're seeing when people are being flooded out of their homes like they were during Ida, or places in New York State where sea level rise is just causing people's homes to be inundated on a regular basis without a big storm. So there's a lot of work that we need to be doing in that regard, and the Bond Act is steering funds into that. It will also help us, in addition to modifying and revitalizing infrastructure for water, help with transportation infrastructure. There are a lot of places in New York State where our roads cross our streams and waterways, and during storms, particularly the large storms we've been seeing over the last several years, we're having more and more roads blow out because culverts need to be retrofitted. So we need to be doing more to consider how we can revitalize our waterfronts, create new access to waterfronts, and also reduce flooding in our communities. This bond deck will also be investing in clean energy and energy efficiency. So that's something obviously is people who care about climate is a good thing. New York State in particular owns significant amounts of facilities, buildings, lands, places like our large university system where we can be citing renewable energy, where we can be making big gains for energy efficiency. This bond act will also provide significant funding to electrify the state's school bus fleet and create energy efficiency in school buildings, which is also, as we know now with COVID upon us, a benefit because you're bringing up to date those air systems in our schools. So there's a lot of communities that are very excited about that. In addition to flooding, climate change, another killer threat of climate change to New Yorkers is deadly heat. And what we have learned is that our neighborhoods that are the most disinvested in, the disadvantaged communities in particular in our cities, are really more devoid of urban forests and natural resources than other areas. And in these areas, when we experience heat waves, the heat waves become deadly. People in these areas often have comorbidities, things like asthma or heart ailments. And so that temperature rise that's happening with climate change becomes a killer threat. And the Bond Act will help us address this by investing in expanding cooling centers and cool pavement, also community gardens, green roofs, and our urban forests. And there are huge campaigns going on in places like New York City, Yonkers, Rochester, to study the way the urban forest is distributed and change that to make it more equitable. This bond act will help with that. And then finally, it's going to provide significant funding for conserving our natural resources. You know, during the pandemic, we saw people getting out into the outdoors for their health, for something to do, for solace, and for their own, mental health. And we haven't seen that excitement over being in the outdoors wane at all. The Nature Conservancy has a system of preserves, and we've seen about a 300% increase to those preserves since the pandemic began. Likewise, state parks is experiencing the same thing. So this bond act will allow us to continue to conserve natural resources we depend on. It'll help us conserve family farms across New York State so that we can continue to grow local food for our communities and also continue to protect wildlife habitat and natural areas that, again, act as buffers to our communities from floodwaters and storm impacts. So really steering into the big issues facing New Yorkers from an environmental perspective. And this bond act is unique in two ways. The first way is that for the first time in a state bond act measure, it includes strong labor language to ensure that the nearly 100,000 jobs that this bond act will support will be family sustaining jobs that are on a career path. This is really exciting. And we have a lot of support from the labor community in our coalition. We have a coalition of about 300 organizations, including Climate Reality, thank you. But it also includes groups like the New York State AFL-CIO, the New York State Conference of Operating Engineers, the New York Building Congress, the plumbers, the painters, they're all coming in to support this because they realize that spending on our environment and on our infrastructure is also job creating. And then in addition to that, this bond act has a provision that is similar to the provision in our state's climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, that requires investment in disadvantaged communities. So this bond act will help advance environmental justice by ensuring that at least 35 to 40% of this funding, of the total funding, is directed into those communities and benefits people that are most harmed by pollution in our state. So this is really also an opportunity to uphold that provision of the state's climate law. So as you heard, as environmental voters, we all have to get ready to vote. So our coalition is working really hard to educate people about this and make sure they understand, when to get out there, when to vote. So we're sharing that information with everyone. Obviously, deadline's coming up soon if you have any changes to make or need to get registered. And then we're also encouraging people to get out and vote. We really want, like Nathaniel said, there are a lot of New Yorkers who forget to vote, and our big risk is that Proposition 1, which will be, at least for number 1, the first proposition on the ballot, but these issue propositions are usually on the back of the ballot. And there's a huge number of people who, even if they get out to vote, forget to flip over their ballot and forget to vote on those propositions. And so we're going to be doing a lot of education coming up in the next month and a half to make sure people know not only do they need to get out and vote, but they need to flip that ballot and make sure that they vote for the Bond Act. So there's more information here. We, as I said, have a really great coalition of organizations and a lot of individual supporters who are making our campaign possible. You can learn more at voteyescleanwaterandjobs.com. I will put that link in the chat for you as well, so you can click on it. And you can also follow us on social media. We just today started a Facebook event to check in and say that you're voting for the Bond Act. So there's going to be lots of ways that you can engage with us on social media. And then if you're part of an organization that's going out and talking to members of the public, we do have a toolkit of resources that I can share as well. That has fact sheets and palm cards and social media graphics that you can just use to your heart's content. I can share that information with people who are interested in it, and I'll put my email for that in the chat as well. So I'm also happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other and continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm taking over for Paul, so yes, you realize it's a different face. But thank you both so much. I feel like there's just so much really important information that you both shared, and wanted to kind of start asking you both some questions. There was a question from Melissa in the chat, and I think it should go to you, Nathaniel. She's simply asking why so many environmentalists aren't voting. I'm sure it's not just a simple answer, but kind of would love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Melissa, for the question. First, let me give you the caveat. So first, let me tell you what we don't know, then I'll tell you what we do know. Social scientists are pretty good at figuring out how to get people to do things. Those are experiments that social scientists are pretty good at setting up. What's harder to do is the opposite. What's a lot harder to do is to figure out, why isn't somebody doing something like voting or things like that? Really, the only way you can try to unpack a problem like that is to ask people. And when you ask people why they don't do something that society views as important, like voting, they lie their pants off. There are a whole lot of survey and response biases that make it really hard to get accurate answers. So with that enormous caveat, let me say, we don't really know for sure why so many environmentalists don't vote. But let me tell you the stuff that we do know. Let me tell you the stuff that gives us a little bit of clarity, even though it doesn't give us a ton of clarity. The first is, when we talk about at least how we identify environmentalists at the Environmental Voter Project, which is as unique and weird a definition as anybody's definition would be, we identify people who have a high likelihood of literally listing these issues as their #1 priority over all others. When you look at that population, they are disproportionately young, they are disproportionately people of color, and they are disproportionately lower income people. What do those 3 demographic groups have in common? Lower income people, people of color, and young people? They are always the object of voter suppression efforts. If anybody anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting people of color, young people, and lower income people. And that is the beating heart of the modern environmental movement. So that's the first thing that's going on here. But it's not everything, because even when we drill down within one of those subgroups, like say, Black Americans or young people, even within those demographic subgroups, environmentalists vote less often than other people. And so there's something else going on there. And what we think is going on there is that for over a generation, the environmental movement has been oddly apolitical. And I realize that's kind of a bold statement, but let me explain what I'm saying here. Chances are you grew up thinking about environmental impact or environmental activism as, don't litter, recycle, change what you eat, change how you get to work, change the electricity you consume. Like, all of which are very impactful, but they're strangely apolitical, right? Like you would never hear someone who cares about guns talk like that, or someone who cares deeply about reproductive freedom talk like that. And it's by design. I mean, the fossil fuel industry has had very sophisticated PR campaigns that were essentially saying, like, don't pay attention to that coal-fired power plant back there. It's all your fault for having like a plastic water bottle in your hand. They didn't want us to be political. They didn't want us to pay attention to these big systemic problems. And I think that has really held us back from being as politically engaged as a lot of other issue constituency groups. So Melissa, I'm sorry we don't have a lot of really definitive answers to your questions, but those are some of the things that we think make up this turnout problem.
Great, thank you so much, Nathaniel. There is another question from Mara, and I think I will pose that to you, Jess. It's two questions. Will there be more than one item on the back of the ballot? So will there be other propositions? And how will this affect my taxes?
Yeah, so good questions. The first one depends on where you live. There are no other statewide ballot measures this year, so we'll be Prop 1 everywhere. But there are other propositions on the ballot. So if you live in New York City, there are several measures related to racial justice. If you live in Gardner, like Paul, you're going to have a measure for local conservation funding. Similarly, on Long Island, there's a local measure on the East End related to affordable housing. So there are some very kind of local, hyper-local issues. Probably the biggest one are the questions, obviously, in New York City, because that's the largest jurisdiction. And then the other question about raising taxes, we hear this a lot. So there is not a tax increase associated with this bond act. This bond act is kind of programmed into the New York State financial plan. So actually, it's an exciting thing as a taxpayer in New York, because it's not often that you get to go to the ballot box and say, I want to make sure part of the money that I'm already paying into the state is going to stuff I care about. And talk about joy for an environmental voter, right? That's what this bond act is. It's an opportunity to direct a portion of our existing funding into these projects. Obviously, it's borrowing, but again, the state borrows funds all the time for large capital infrastructure projects. So they're going to be doing a lot of borrowing anyway. And what this bond act will do is ensure that a portion of that is dedicated to these purposes. So as a voter, I'm really excited about that, because it's an opportunity to have more of a voice about how my tax dollars are spent in the upcoming years.
Great, thank you. We always love to hear when there won't be more taxes. And we're getting really amazing, things done as well. Nathaniel, Susie would like to know, how much of a commitment does one have to make to get involved with the Environmental Voter Project, and how quickly can one get trained?
Great questions. So you don't need to make any commitment. Go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, click the Get Involved tab, sign up for an upcoming phone bank if you want to do a phone bank. I'll just use that as an example. And if at any time you decide you don't like what you're seeing, you just hang up. That's it, no commitment. But if you do like what you're seeing, we will offer you a training in the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll get you on to what's called a predictive dialer. So you can quickly cycle through these phone calls. You won't have to use your own phone number, anything like that. We'll give you a script that is nonpartisan, but we know it's proven in previous randomized control trials to increase turnout. And then the phone banks usually last, including the training, for about an hour and a half. Now, will we like send someone to your door if you log off early? No, there is no commitment. But simply by being here, you have self-selected as people who care deeply about addressing the climate crisis and addressing the democracy crisis. And what I can tell you is that this stuff works. It works. And so if you are looking in your life over the next 6 weeks for an opportunity to have an impact, to support things like this climate bond measure, to support climate leaders who are on your ballot, this is a great opportunity. And if it takes you 45 minutes to get trained instead of 15, that's fine. We've got tons of great trained staff and trained volunteers who are there to help you out and hold your hand and make sure this works for you. Because I'll tell you a dirty little secret about how all campaigns run. The whole point of the first time that a volunteer shows up for something like this is to make sure that they come back. We don't expect to get a great return on the investment of your time the first time you show up, because you're learning this stuff and you're trying to get comfortable. And so believe me, we try to do everything we can to make you understand that this is a really, really good experience. And then finally, at the end of it, the end of every shift, you're going to get an email telling you all the data, all the contact data, how many people you spoke with, how many conversations the whole phone bank had. It'll be great. And canvassing is just as easy. We have people canvassing on Long Island, tons of people canvassing in the Hudson Valley, people canvassing all over New York.
Great, thank you. Sounds super exciting. I've done it in the past with other organizations and campaigns, so I think I'm going to do it. Sounds great. Jess, wanted to ask you, there's a question from Dennis, just asking kind of for an explanation or kind of like the difference between, the bond you were talking about, Prop 1, and then, there's been, the Climate Act and, some other climate legislation that, has been worked on, not just in the state, but also federally. So can you kind of talk about the differences and also maybe, specifically why, Prop 1 is really important with like the next set of things that we're trying to get done?
Yeah, and before I do that, I will just really thank Nathaniel once again for the work that the Voters Project does, and say that if environmental voters turn out in this election in New York, it's going to be good for the Bond Act as well. So if you do choose to get involved, that's actually a great way also to help with this issue. So it's really an incredible team that they have and a system that they have to get people involved at an individual level. And not all campaigns, including ours, can operate that way, right? Like we have to prioritize kind of some larger, digital strategies to make sure that we're efficiently spending kind of a one-time campaigns funding. So, thinking about groups like Environmental Voters Project and the work they do to get people out, regardless of what's on the ballot, is really uplifting for the entire environmental community. So thank you again, Nathaniel. And then on the Bond Act and kind of the differences between the Bond Act and these other measures. So, a lot of the measures that you mentioned are about creating policy. So, the climate policy that requires emissions reductions in New York State, or, would require the electrification of buildings. Nothing in the Bond Act is any kind of requirement or policy law. So the Bond Act is not setting policy. The Bond Act is funding for capital projects. And those projects are ways that, and sometimes we can help implement policy. So, by spending money on things like electric school buses or electrification of buildings, or adding renewable energy or increasing energy efficiency, we'll be cutting emissions, and that will help the state achieve its climate goals. Likewise, by making sure that we're reducing flood risks, we can be helping people adapt to climate change. But there's nothing in the Bond Act that's mandating those changes. It's an implementation mechanism so that communities can implement priorities around, climate mitigation, climate adaptation, conservation of natural resources, protecting clean water. So I hope that makes sense and answers the question.
Great, thank you so much. And kind of wanted to ask you both, it's a question from Paul, about voting rights. In 2020, there were definitely some propositions put forth that failed, that didn't make it through. And so wondering from you both, like in the work you do, were there any learnings from those situations? Like how did it change how you're approaching the midterms and where we're at now?
Jess, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll just say, yeah, those were on the ballot last year in New York. It was Props 1, 3, and 4. And there was actually an environmental measure sandwiched right in the middle there, Prop 2, which gave everyone the constitutional right to clean water and clean air. And it was pretty incredible that being positioned the way it was did as well as it did. I think it earned in the mid 60% of the vote, which is incredible. I will say that, I think a big lesson there was that there wasn't a really strong vote yes campaign that came out for those measures. They were really complicated. I was actually kind of cross-eyed reading and trying to figure out what a couple of them meant before I went to vote. So, they were very complicated, and they weren't something that was explained well to voters. And then there was a very organized opposition to those, and there was not a vote yes campaign that was anywhere close to significant enough to match that very well-funded vote no campaign. And so, I think, the Nature Conservancy runs ballot measures in states around the country every election cycle, and that's something that we look out for. We work to make sure that the measures are written in a way that's clear. There's a reason that we work to make sure the name of this was clean water, clean air, green jobs. It's pretty self-explanatory. But we also work really hard to raise the resources needed to run a robust vote yes campaign. We're running a $4 million campaign for the Bond Act in New York to make sure voters understand what it is, what it will do for them, and why they should turn out and vote for it. So I think, given what happened last year, we're definitely taking this year's election very seriously. We're operating in a really polarized time, and people are feeling pretty punchy when they walk into the voting booth. And so we're not taking anything for granted.
I don't have much to add. I'll just say that this is one place where, the work that Jess does at the Nature Conservancy is so much harder than what we're trying to do at the Environmental Voter Project, because there is, a lot of these ballot measures are not self-explanatory, and oftentimes voters don't have the bandwidth to walk into the polling place knowing all of this stuff. And so the good news is, on most environmental issues, when you reduce it to a binary and force people to choose between making government protect the environment or not, they want to choose environmental protection. That's the great thing about ballot measures. The scary thing is there is some room for confusion, and there's a whole lot of fossil fuel money that sows confusion. And so please, to the extent you're able, support their work promoting this ballot measure, because this is what we at EVP try to avoid, is like the messy stuff of voter education and issue education. But that doesn't mean that it's unimportant. It is important with stuff like this. And it does lead to people exhausting their ballots, not going all the way down, or not flipping it over, or just having people, not know what they're voting on. And that's a problem.
Thank you both. Last question. Maura had another great question and wanted to ask about objections, which I know are not our favorite thing. A lot of the, what you both are working for, in a lot of ways, humans should care about the environment. Why wouldn't you want clean water, clean air? But, when you all are having conversations, whether it's through your work or maybe it's personally, how do you respond to kind of some of the objections that you get to what you're working on, even if it's just to kind of help us in the everyday convos we have?
Yeah, well, our whole approach at the Environmental Voter Project is we try to bypass that. We're not trying to convince people to support a particular measure or a particular issue or even care about a particular thing. Not to say that's unimportant. It is very important to have those difficult conversations, and it's very important to change minds. But it's hard and it's messy, and you can't even test and figure out like which messages are working that well and which messages aren't working well. And so our whole MO at the Environmental Voter Project is let's bypass the hardest stuff of politics, which is discussions just like that, and instead find the people who are already with us and they just need a behavioral intervention. Not that that's easy. Of course, changing behavior isn't easy, but it is easier. And perhaps more importantly, it's testable. So you can figure out what's working and what isn't working and iterate and reiterate on the stuff that is working. And so I certainly recognize the important place that a question like that comes from. But what I would suggest to you is, oh my gosh, is there so much political power just there for the taking for we in the environmental movement without even having to have those really difficult conversations, struggling with climate deniers or climate delayers or people, talking about alarmism. Like, we should work with them and we should talk to them. But just so you know, our path to political power doesn't have to go through them. There are enough of us as there is. We just ain't showing up when we need to be showing up. And if we can fix that problem, we can get our local, state, and federal legislation through pretty much anywhere. Because there are a lot of us, we're just not voting yet.
Yeah, and I'll just say a little differently. I think that there are people, when you do this kind of research, like the research Nathaniel talked about, and like the research we do on our work, whether it's the Bond Act or just issues that we're working on, it's really important because you learn where people are, and then you can meet them where they're at. And I think that a lot of people in the environmental movement think that they think the way everyone else does. They're like, I'm a regular person, but the fact is you might not be, right? And so it's really about doing research to understand how to talk to people in a way that will let them hear you. And let them connect with the issue. On the Bond Act campaign, we did really robust research, including a model like the one Nathaniel talked about, where we talked to thousands of people to understand not only who was going to show up, but how they were going to behave when they showed up. And from research like that, you can understand that there are a lot of people that aren't, necessarily forever opponents. They may be able to get there. It just depends on how you talk to them about the issue in a way that connects with their life or disarms them. So that's really important too, is for the environmental movement to kind of take less for granted and do the research that's needed to speak in a compelling way.
Well, great. Thank you both so much, Nathaniel and Jessica. This was a wonderful conversation, and we really appreciated your presentations. I think we're all very excited to get out and vote, and we kind of fingers crossed about the results and the turnout. But thank you both. I think we're all feeling really energized.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And Jess, it's such an honor to be here speaking with you.
Same, yes. And thank you all for having us.
And just one more thing, we're going to have Regina Valdez talk about a really exciting trip that we have coming up next month. So Regina, I will pass it to you.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say, for the first ever hybrid meeting, you guys did a tremendous job. And I have to say there were very few, if I didn't notice any technical snafu. So A+ for the team over there. And to the guests who spoke tonight, you were so, I was so enraptured by hearing you. I was actually quite inspired. And so I want to thank you so much. And yes, we have to show up. So let's show up, everyone. And in that vein, I want to make an announcement, a very exciting announcement, because many of you have spoken to the idea of wanting to increase community, to be able to spend FaceTime, actual FaceTime together. And we've come up with a perfect event in which to do that. Each year, the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, which is part of the climate school at Columbia University, and one of the first Earth observatories here in the States, studying our only planet, is having its annual open house. And that is going to be Saturday, October 8th. And let me tell you, I have been to many of these open houses and they are so much fun. It's like a day trip, because it is a day trip. It's a free, fun day trip. It's up in, I don't know, Rockland County. And there's free transportation. And I am going to put information in the chat box just as soon as I find it. And there are many, so it's a day filled with nature because you're in their beautiful campus. There's many lectures, demonstrations, exhibits, and they have a lot of, oh, I just pasted my Wordle score. Let me delete that. I'm sure you don't want to see my Wordle score. Yeah, so there's a lot of wonderful things. It's a day of learning and fun. And they also have a lot of food vendors there, food and drink. So I just put the link in the chat box, and there's a button there to register. And along with registering, there's free transportation. There are shuttle buses that leave from Teachers College at 120th and Broadway. You just like go on up to the bus, have a nice seat in the clean energy bus, and they drive you up to the beautiful campus. So please do check out that link that I put there. It'll be a time for us all to get together. I know many of us on the leadership team will be there, and we want you all to be there as well. We will get our agendas and we'll see who's going to what event, and we'll all meet during lunch, and we'll hopefully take the bus up there together. So please consider coming. It's a lot of fun. And once again, I want to thank the presenters who presented tonight. I want to thank all of you who came, especially thank the people who had the wonderful questions. I know I learned a lot. And so let's just keep showing up. Let's take what we learned from tonight and continue on with the powerful contingent that we are. And with that, I am going to wish you all a wonderful good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that link.
Yeah.
I'm going to put it again.
Yeah.
Gina, is it appropriate to bring small kids?
Absolutely. The question with kids, absolutely do. It's for people of all ages who are curious about science, the planet, and everything that it involves life on this planet. Do come, bring children of all ages.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll send out all that information in a little newsletter.
Thank you, Paul.
Great.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone. Thanks
Good
so
night.
much.
Thank you.
And the meeting.